Hi, I'm Bart Everson, and this is the introduction to a workshop I did on using Feedly. Actually, in this presentation, I'm not going to get into the details of how to use Feedly, but rather just give you a quick introduction to feeds and aggregators and some other stuff. It's kind of background, deep background on understanding what Feedly is and why you might want to use it. But I'll point you at the end to some resources to help you get started with Feedly. First, I wanted to give credit where credit is due. The inspiration for this workshop came when Sue France visited our campus not too long ago. Now, Sue France is a kind of well-known techno guru, also a teacher in higher education. And so when she visited Xavier's campus, I looked her in the eye and I said, Sue, there's so many pieces of technology out there, so many different softwares and websites and services, and you write and recommend, you write about many of these and recommend them on your website and so forth. But faculty are so busy, and I have such a limited ability to get faculty's attention. I might only be able to do one workshop a semester on a technology subject. So what would you recommend that I focus on? If I could only do just one workshop, what would it be? What would be at the very top of your list? And she thought for a moment, and this is what she came up with. She said, Feedly. No question. And if you want to learn more about Sue France, visit her website for sure, suefrance.com. You'll find a wealth of information there. I should warn you that much of what follows is going to veer into the realm of the esoteric and geeky. So hang on to your hats. The problem, the way I phrased it when I did a similar kind of workshop 10 years ago was that there are several websites you like to read regularly, but going around to each website checking for new content is a drag. And as I revisited this for 2014, I framed the problem in very much the same way with a slight difference. I said, there's too much information. There are so many sites of interest on the net, and you can't possibly go around from site to site and read what's new on all of them. So you see, the problem has really remained the same, except that it's increased perhaps in volume. What we're seeing today is that there are, this feeling of information overload. But the problem, the solution, then as now, one solution, perhaps, is the idea of the aggregator. An aggregator is a piece of software that collects information from around the web on your behalf. And you may hear these called other things such as a news aggregator, a feed aggregator, an RSS reader, a news reader, a feed reader. And we'll see in a moment why some of those names exist. I wanted to give you a quick look at what an example of this looks like. We'll look at Feedly later, but here's a screenshot of Newsfire, which is a desktop aggregator for the Mac. And as you can see here on the left, it's pulling information from various sites, and on the right I'm seeing the latest headlines from the American Zombie. And if I click on any one of those, then I will actually see the full story and so forth. But in order to understand what's going on with an aggregator, you have to understand the concept of the feed and how a web feed fits into the overall architecture of the web. As I said, the aggregator is pulling information from different sites, and it does this by using what are called web feeds. So what is a web feed? Well, it's a data format indexing structured content. And let that, again, that is kind of esoteric and geeky, so let that sink in for a moment. A data format indexing structured content. Let's look, here's the actual code of a feed for the Cat Food for Thought blog. You can see the actual code But most of us don't want to look at something like this. This is not really designed to be looked at by human beings. It's designed to be machine readable. So a lot of times if you pop something like this, if it actually comes up in your browser will try to dress it up a little bit and give it a somewhat more user-friendly appearance. So here's the same feed as it might be displayed in a web browser like Firefox. And you see it gives me the option to subscribe to this feed using any aggregators that the browser may be aware of. And then below that I see cat food for thought and kind of a nicer display. And you see all that it really is headlines and links pointing to the content on the website. A blog is an excellent example of structured content, and a feed you can think of as just an index of that structured content. To give you just a real quick history of how web feeds came to be, we can go back to as far back as 1995 when a guy named Ramanathan V. Guha and some other people in Apple Computer's Advanced Technology Group developed something called the Meta Content Framework for a product called Hot Sauce, which apparently was to allow a kind of 3D visualization of your file system, which, as it turned out, nobody really wanted to do that, but it did lead into the period, what I call the period of mess and acrimony, where a number of digital luminaries, people like Dave Weiner and Tim Bray, got involved with trying to develop different formats for web feeds. And this is also quickly followed by the era of what I call the proliferation of little orange buttons. You may remember back around 10 years ago, we started to see these little orange buttons popping all up around the internet as people tried to start using feeds with their websites, and people just weren't clear on how they should link to those. So they started making little buttons like that. Actually, they took a lot of different forms. They weren't always little, they weren't always orange, and they didn't always say XML on them. That's just probably the most common version, but they would say sometimes RSS, RDF, Atom, all kinds of different things. One reason there's so many different acronyms is that there was a lot of confusion about what format was going to be best. And what ultimately percolated out of all of that was two major formats, which now really are the formats that you'll hear about most often, RSS and Atom. And those are the two major formats for web feeds that are in use these days. RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication, or so some people allege. No one really knows what RSS stands for because, again, all the mess and acrimony that surrounded the development. But that phrase, Really Simple Syndication, encapsulates the idea of a web feed really well, the idea of being able to syndicate that content out to other services. And eventually, rather quickly in fact, the web designers moved away from the little orange XML buttons and embraced an icon that may be kind of familiar. You see it around much more commonly these days, and that is an orange button with white radio waves, and that has become the kind of standard de facto symbol with a lot of variations, but it's a symbol for a web feed. When you click on something like that, you'll probably be linking to a web feed. Well, that was about 10 years ago. So what have happened in the last 10 years? Not too much. In fact, the format has been very stable, which is a good thing. You might say it's kind of boring, but nevertheless, not much has been going on with the format of web feeds for the last 10 years. Which may lead some people to, has led, in the kind of go atmosphere of Silicon Valley and so forth, that may lead some people to say, well, feeds are not important, feeds are dead. But that would be, I think, a big mistake. It's important to understand that feeds are an integral part of the series of tubes that make up the internet. In particular, feeds matter because they are free, open, interoperable, machine readable, a standard for sharing information between services. It's a large part, a very important part of kind of how the web works behind the scenes. And I think one of the best examples of this is podcasting. If anybody has ever subscribed to a podcast and had it actually work successfully, where the audio file gets automatically kind of loaded onto your iPod the next time you sync it with iTunes, that all happens seemingly magically. It happens because of web feeds. Web feeds are being used by one service to another to communicate the fact that there is new content available and to do something with that content. So that's a real quick overview of what feeds are and how they fit into the architecture of the web. The aggregator allows us to kind of tap directly into the feeds and take some advantage of their existence. So a real quick history would begin in 2001 with FeedReader, which is the first personal desktop RSS reader. Quickly followed by a proliferation of desktop aggregators. These are software programs that run on desktop computers. Things like NetNewsWire, NewsCrawler, FeedDemon, Shrook, RSS Bandit, RSS Owl, and many others. And that was quickly followed by the rise of the web-based aggregators. Things like Bloglines, MyFeedster, MyYahoo, but most prominently by Google Reader. Google launched its reader back in 2005, and it eventually became, I think, the most popular aggregator for a lot of people. It was discontinued, though, last year in 2013. And even though it was so popular, we may speculate as to why Google wanted to discontinue it. Marco Arment speculated that the real reason for the closure was to promote Google+, which is Google's social network, and that it signaled the end of the era of unrestricted and interoperable web services like RSS from large organizations like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. So as Marco Arment said, Google Reader is just the latest casualty of the war that Facebook started seemingly accidentally, the battle to own everything. Well, regardless of whether we subscribe to that theory or not, I wanted to introduce you to Feedly. Yes, it's an aggregator, as you can guess from everything I've said so far. That's what we're focusing in on. It's available as both as an extension you can install in most of the major web browsers. It's also a cloud-based service, so you can go to feedly.com, and that's what we'll be doing in our workshop. And it's also available as a mobile app for mobile devices. It was created by a company called DevHD, which was founded in 2006, and Feedly was released in the summer of 2008. It was originally called Feedo, or Feedo maybe. This standard plan is free with no ads, and a pro version is available, which has more features. And finally, I wanted to note that after Google Reader announced that it was closing, Feedly got more than 500,000 new users in 2 days' time and 3 million in the following 2 weeks. So we probably wouldn't be having this focus on Feedly if it wasn't for the closure of Google Reader. I didn't want to come out too strongly, though, in favor of Feedly as just one product that's out there, because there is a lot of competition in this space. And I'd invite you to look at some other programs that are available. These are the top 10 according to alternative2.net, which is a great website for finding alternatives to any individual piece of software. And that is pretty much the overview of feeds and aggregators. You can find more support on our wiki for some resources for getting started with Feedly. And I thank you for your attention today.